He goes, "Do you know your grandfather had a violin all the way through combat?" And I'm like, holy my God. I'm like, really? He said, "Oh yeah. When we were on the front lines, he'd have a mute on it. He'd sit in his tent and play his violin in the tent while we're near the front lines, and we could hear this a mute like mutes it, right? But you could
Uh-huh.
still hear the playing. But then when we were back off the lines, he'd play his violin." And I'm like, holy moly.
Are you a fan of horror movies? Then you've definitely heard of the Saw series. Would you believe it if I told you that there was an Assyrian behind the camera making the Saw films? Well, believe it. Hey everyone, it's great to be back for another episode of the Assyrian podcast. This is Ninorta bringing you episode number 164 with David Armstrong. David was the cinematographer for the first 6 Saw movies and was also the director of Pawn and The Assassin's Code. David's love for stories and storytelling started at an early age from when his grandfather shared his stories with him. At that time, David decided to record his grandfather whenever he would share these stories, which in turn sparked the writing of his book, Dragons and Violins. Dragons and Violins is a book about love, war, hope, and the American dream. The book tells the story of his grandfather's journey through life, which covers the Assyrian Genocide, immigrating to America, World War II, and so much more. I'm very glad that I got to sit with David to discuss his world in Hollywood and his journey writing Dragons and Violins. Before we begin, I'd like to take this opportunity to remind you to make sure to subscribe to the podcast, rate and review us wherever you're listening. Also, if you know someone who should be a guest of the podcast or even a host in your country, please reach out to us. You can find out more information on our website. This episode is sponsored by the Ushana Partners, a husband and wife real estate team. Are you considering purchasing or selling a home in Arizona or California? John and Rita are available to help make your next real estate decision into a seamless transaction. Contact the Ushanas at 209-968-9519. Get to know them a bit more by checking out their website, theushanapartners.com. And now, here's David Armstrong. David, thank you so much for being here with us on the Assyrian podcast. I know this has been a long time trying to schedule this with you, communicating with Ruth, who was a previous guest on the podcast. So I'm glad we were able to finally sit down and have this conversation. So thank you for being here.
No, I appreciate it. Thank you. I mean, Ruth was very enthusiastic, and I listened to her podcast. It was great. So, and she asked me, I said, yeah, absolutely. And then at the same time, she was meeting my cousin, Sarah Bennett. Mm-hmm. And then they actually were meeting for lunch, like in New York, like the day I spoke to Ruth. And I said, oh, that's my cousin. And then I called her and whatnot. Sarah is, with Assyrians, everyone's a cousin.
Yes.
But she's actually a real cousin. Her great grandfather was the brother to my grandmother.
Okay.
So
they were siblings. No, you got it.
Made it move. So shout out to Sarah. And I haven't met Sarah in person yet.
Really?
It's just been phone calls and texts and all this time. Wow. When we discovered each other. It was 23andMe. And we reached out and I have found other third cousin. She's my third cousin. I have another third cousin. His name is Adani Esho. He's from Iraq and he's in Chicago. And so
that's interesting. I've never done 23andMe, but since you said you've done it, what was that experience like?
Well, there's as you approach the thing, they'll connect you with all the people that are related to you, and if you want, they'll give you your health thing too. Like you're prone to getting this cancer or prone to giving that, and they have it, but I didn't buy it. I was like, I don't want to know. It's like you're prone to being crippled the rest of your life. Oh my God, I don't want to know that. So if I should ever need it, it's there. But it was. I'm pretty good about not knowing things I don't want to unknow or see things, and someone says, oh, you guys see this on YouTube, this is the worst thing ever. I'm like, no. I don't want the worst thing ever in my head. So thank you very much. But it's really fascinating because I can tell from 23andMe which side. There's a lot of Assyrians that are on there, and I'm half Assyrian on my mother's side, and the other half is French and Scottish, you
Mm-hmm.
know. And so so on 23andMe it's almost a 50-50. It'll say, Euro Asia
Mm-hmm.
50% and then Europe 50. So when I meet someone, I can click on them and see relatives we have in common. And then I know by who they're related to, which side of the family they're coming from, my grandfather's side or my grandmother's side.
Wow.
That's how I met Adani. And it's strange because his brother looks just like me. He showed a picture of his mother, a picture of me, and he has a beard and mustache. And she said, "When did your brother shave?" And he goes, "No, that's not my brother, your son. It's someone else." It's really freaky. I look a lot like him.
Wow.
And then my other cousin, a man named Pierre Nogle, who's up in Turlock. He puts on all the Assyrian concerts that go up there, and he's a drummer and a producer, and he's all those great big shows that happen up in Turlock. Pierre is behind a lot of them.
Wow.
And PR's played with the famous Middle Eastern band members. I'm really bad with the names. The guy who has a white violin, I remember he's toured the world with him. And so I've grown up always being told Pierre was my cousin, but it's like, you're Syrian, everyone's your cousin. Oh, you're Armenian. Oh, we're cousins, right? And then 23andMe, we both did it, and we were like, holy beep,
It's true.
We're true. We're cousins. We're third cousins. And his uncle is my second cousin. And he lives not far from me. And so I was like, oh my God, we really are related. And his mother was like, I told you guys were. So it's been quite fascinating. I'm really into that. I mean, if anyone's ever, if you read my book, I mean, not
I have read it, yes.
but you could tell it was quite a journey. It took me 10 years to do the book, 6 years of research, and then 4 years of writing. And I work in Hollywood, and I'm really I have a lot of scripts and stories, and I've directed. I've been a cinematographer. I have so storytelling is really my game, and I didn't want to make up stuff. About my grandfather.
You wanted the facts.
I wanted the facts. Like I always grew up with my grandfather saying, when we came to America, suddenly there was these huge explosions in the sky and everyone panicked on the ship. But we were later told it's the 4th of July. Right. And then you grow up and like you starting to put it all down to paper. You're like, did you really come on the 4th of July? That sure sounds like just good old grandfather stuff to a grandson.
What made David Armstrong who he is today?
Oh my goodness. What a good question. What a stumper too. Well, I was born at an early age. Actually, my grandfather used to say that. I love storytelling. I mean, it knew it before I knew it. As a kid, I always had a camera in my hand. I always had a Super 8 camera with a projector and a splicer, and I was always making movies. I had no idea that people made movies, but I just loved movies. And, back in the day before VCRs or anything, I used to take pictures like with a still camera of my favorite movie scenes and try to capture them. Like when I was 8 and 9, and like I'd just sit in front of the camera, I'd frame it up and click. So I was always loving movies. And it was my uncle, my grandfather's son, Paul, who I was like, I think I was 14, and he's like, well, what do you want to be when you grow up? And I gave a real smart answer all 14-year-olds give, which is, I don't know. And he said, well, you ought to be a cinematographer. You love movies and you always have a camera. And I was like, oh, that's a great idea. And I was like, well, what's a cinematographer? I'm like, I'd never heard of that before. So that was sort of my course trajectory of being behind the camera. And I have a bachelor's degree and a master's in cinematography. My master's from AFI, the American Film Institute, and I was a camera assistant for like 8 years, and then after graduating from AFI, I became a cinematographer and started shooting a lot of movies. And strangely enough, I got known for horror movies. Horror movies is what my name got tagged to. The film industry, I don't think it necessarily. You don't get to pick it picks you. I think careers are that way. I mean, you never think back, this is what I'm going to do. And sometimes it happens, I knew I wanted to be in movies. take the artist path, which I don't know if I'd recommend it. It's the traditional artist path. It's feast or famine, and that. But I just started. I just loved being movies. I loved being on movie sets, and along with my fiance Valerie, we write scripts together. We have them at different stages. They've won, we've gotten into great big competitions with them. So we've done well. And I'm always at different stages of projects that are being made. And about 8 years ago, I turned to being a director, and which is something I never wanted to do. I thought I never wanted to direct because as a cinematographer, the show you'd end for the day shoot and you're going to go have a drink with your crew, and the director's getting dragged into another room getting yelled at by the producers. And I was like, I don't want that job. But like I said, it just sort of made sense one day, and I just started directing, and which was nice because at that point I had 30 years of experience on a film set. So directors who get on movies who've written a script but maybe have no set experience, it could be overwhelming. And for me, it's home, right? So that's who I've been. That's been the thrust of my whole life is storytelling and filmmaking. And I didn't even know I liked storytelling, even though I was doing it. It's sort of reflections back in life, and you're like, oh, I really like telling stories.
So what are some movies that you've worked on that, our listeners can be like, oh, wow.
Yeah. I'm known for, there's a franchise called Saw, the Saw franchise, the Saw horror movies. I shot the first 6 of those. So Saw 1 through 6. I've been involved with those, which, James Wan was the executive producer and directed the first one. James is, you probably know if you don't know his name, his movies are Fast and Furious 8, I think it was, Aquaman, Insidious, The Conjuring. And so, James was just literally off the boat from Australia and out of film school when I met him, and we started making that movie together, and a lot of other lesser known horror movies and non-horror movies too. Which is kind of, I think has sort of an oxymoron. If you think that about me and then you read my book about my grandfather, it's like,
two completely different
only
things.
horror in there are the Turks. So other than that, because it's as a story, as a cinematographer, a good cinematographer can really photograph any movie. You get the story and you get the vision of the director. So, and that's what I was doing. I was following a vision, and then I maintained that look as different directors came through, because I was the one from the beginning, back when it was a low budget $1 million film on the first Saw. So, but it's funny, I started this, I started the research on this book just a year or two before I did Saw. So we're running that
all kind of,
they were going side by side. So, and this is my passion, this book, but making movies as well.
Yeah, I can definitely tell that the writing was, you were very passionate about it.
Oh, thank you.
What is the latest film that you're working on right now? What can you tell us about it?
Well, the latest thing I'm working on are scripts. So I have, we have a pilot. It's called Girl's Guide to the Zombie Apocalypse. And it's a great little pilot for a potential TV series of, it has zombies in it, but our zombies come from the medical community, meaning nanobots are the technology in our story. Nanobots have gotten to the point where you can just go to the beautician and you got wrinkles or gray hair or a blemish or something, and then we send nanobots in and they'll fix it. But the nanobots in our story kind of go, wait a minute, everything in the human body is kind of screwed up. We should retool it. So that goes awry. And so the zombie-esque characters in our story are are not traditional zombies, but that you got to kill them through the heart, so you stop the blood, and you make a joke like, oh, shoot him in the brain, like no, that's not going to do anything, because that's usually what it is in zombies. And it revolves around a 14-year-old girl who is rescued by a 14-year-old boy who has Asperger's, and these two have to navigate their way through Los Angeles. They end up on the Universal backlot trying to hide out on a pirate ship with a moat around it because the zombies don't know what to do with the water. So it's a safe place. So it's heartfelt. It's really, how the adults are screwing up the world for kids. And here we got two 14-year-olds going, this is not of our making, which is so pertinent to, the environment, right? Because 14-year-olds don't have a lot of say in like what the adults are doing or not doing.
Yeah.
So we have that series. And I have a true Vietnam rescue story that is really a great story about two downed pilots that were rescued by this pilot who received the Medal of Honor. And it was the first Navy pilot to receive the Medal of Honor. We have that. We have one that's like Lake House meets It's a Wonderful Life, where this present day historian, history teacher at school finds a letter in this old house that was sent to someone back in World War II, but she realized it was stuck in the mailbox. This girl never got this letter saying, hey, I'd like to meet you when I come home from the war. So she writes this letter of like, oh, wouldn't it have been nice? This is what would have been nice to write. And the letter accidentally gets mailed. And she's like, oh, well. And 2 weeks later, she gets a letter from 1944 saying, oh my God, I'm so happy to hear from you. And she's like, okay, what's the joke? But it keeps going. And the twist of the movie is she starts researching this guy, finds out he got killed in World War II. So she gets this idea, what if I write a letter, have him go left instead of right, and he can get saved? Instead of being in the place where he got killed, I'll say, hey, go over here to meet my brother. And she does. She saves his life. And she discovers in this little town, these eight soldiers that came home from World War II, had children and populated this town, are suddenly gone. It's now the 8 soldiers that didn't come home from World War II, and they never had their children. And she's changed the town, and it's not this wonderful place like It's a Wonderful Life. It's like, and so she's like, oh my God, I have to undo somehow what I've done and get this guy killed to maybe reset time.
Oh my gosh.
So it's love letters through time, and we have comedies. And we're Valerie and I are a little bit of everything. It drives our manager crazy. He's always like, pick one topic and stay with it. We're like, no.
So who has been the most influential movie star that you've worked with?
Movie star. I guess that's going to be Ray Liotta.
Okay.
Ray Liotta was in my first film I directed, and Ray was great, called Pawn, P-A-W-N. The phone rang, and I was in Connecticut prepping the movie, and the phone rang with a number from Los Angeles that I didn't recognize. And I said, hi, hello. And he goes, Dave, it's Ray Liotta. I'm like, well, no kidding. It's Ray Liotta. And I said an expletive. I was like, oh, wow, it's you. And he goes, what does that mean? I said, well, not every day, Ray Liotta calls you. And he laughed and he goes, F you. And I go, and we laughed. And he says, let's have dinner. I'm like, okay. And so when he came out, we met for dinner and we had a great time. He's like, I see you've done a lot. You've been in the business, like, I think at that point, maybe 35 years. So he says, but this is your first film director. He goes, yeah, first time director, but not first time on the set. So when Ray got out here and we started doing scenes, there was some notes that came from the producers that he didn't agree with. And he just pulled me aside. He says, look, do you want it like this or do you want it like this? I said, oh, I want it like that. He says, then just stick to your guns. You know what you're doing. This is what's going to be the best thing. And I know you know it. And he's like, and he was only there for 2 days. He didn't have to take the time. He could have just done his job, and not in a rude way. He could just done his job and delivered what I wanted, and that. But I mean, that he said that meant the world to me. And I remember he texted me from the airport. He says, "Don't let anyone give you any shit." He says, "You know what you're doing. Take care." And I was like, I wish I'd saved that text. But that meant the world to me because I think Ray's just amazing. The movies he's done are amazing, and he's so much like the characters he plays. He's just no BS, straightforward. He's a straight shooter, and that's such a great thing to have on a movie set. You just know what you're dealing with. There's nothing worse than trying to figure out what people are thinking or saying, which is happening all the time. It's artists everywhere, but Ray was really, really great. That was my first time directing, and I've met a lot of actors over the years. way back. But yeah, I'd say Ray Liotta. That always left a great impression on me. Just a little encouragement that meant the world to me.
So I'm horrible with like actors' names, and I just had to Google him. So for our listeners, he's the guy in Goodfellas.
What other movies?
Oh, he was in Field of Dreams. He was in Hannibal.
Oh, he was great in Field of Dreams.
Mm-hmm.
Just had this great little emotional scene. It was a little unknown back in Field of Dreams.
Yeah, he's also done TV shows like Shades of Blue.
No,
But
Ray's
mainly Goodfellas. Yeah.
well, Ray, yeah, Goodfellas, but yeah, Ray's done so many things. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's awesome. Okay, so I want to dive into the book, Dragons and Violins, that you wrote. So the title is Dragons and Violins, a memoir of war and music. Can you tell us what is the book about?
My grandfather. What else do you need to know?
That's it. End of
It.
podcast.
Podcast. Thank you. I know it always, I know you've read it, and it has a huge sweep to it, right? And it's always funny the reaction when I say to people, I'm like, oh, I wrote this book about my grandfather. Everyone gets this look on their face, like, oh, how quaint,
Yeah. But your grandfather is a really cool dude.
It's got a huge scope. You got World War I, the Russian Revolution, the Turkish Genocide, coming to America, the American Depression, World War II. I mean, it's backdrops galore. As I started to say earlier, it came about because my grandfather was a great storyteller. And it's funny, in thinking about this podcast today, I was thinking, oh, I guess maybe I got that from my grandfather. So even though he was a great storyteller, I never quite connected, oh, I do the same thing. I love telling stories, and so did he. But there's also something about stories. I hate for stories to get lost. And I find that in this life, I'm good about warnings, things to come. I've heard so many times people say, oh, I wish I'd gotten those stories from my grandmother or my grandfather, before they died. And I remember thinking, well, I don't want that to happen. So I sat down. I have about 25 hours of recorded video with him. I came up, we did over like several months period. And I started off at the beginning from what he knew of his life, being born in Ormia. And we just kept moving forward. And his two nephews, when my grandfather was an uncle at 6, his nephews were like 2 and 3. So they were still alive. I was able to talk to them and many relatives. I have endless boxes of stuff. My grandfather kept everything. Like, I have all their paperwork from the Caucasus coming to America. On the paperwork, it says reason to coming to America. My grandmother had them type to escape being killed by the Turks. Right there in black and white, Well, it's now yellow and black. The paper's faded, but I have those framed, and I didn't want those stories to be lost. There's something magical in stories, and there's so many people dying all the time. You can't get all the stories, and not all stories maybe are worth telling. But not judging anyone else's story, but I didn't want mine to go, and I just had heard enough people say to me in life, going, "Oh, I wish I had recorded. I wish I had written them down." And so I made sure to record them and write them down. And being a purist as a storyteller, as I said earlier, I wanted to verify things. I got verified. So as I mentioned earlier about him coming to America on the 4th of July, he remembered the name of the ship. And that's all I had. I didn't have names to go through. So it was the King Alexander, and I found a ship's manifest for a King Alexander ship that came in on July 2nd, 1921. And one thing I learned is you think people come to America, boat pulls up and you get off. But no, there's a bunch of boats, and they got to process people. So you sit on the boat until they're ready to call. So I had found that his boat arrived on July 2nd, and he processed through Ellis Island on July 5th. I was like, holy cow. He really was on the boat during the 4th of July. He was right? Not that, I mean, not that I didn't think he wasn't telling me the truth, but I just, I didn't want to put a book out there and have everyone challenge me and go, well, he said he did. And the name game with Assyrians is a nightmare. Absolute nightmare, right? And because I have paperwork from when they were in the Caucasus trying to come to America, I have ships manifests, and everything is spelled completely different. You have no idea why you're looking up these spellings until they explained to me at Ellis Island that Ellis Island doesn't change names. They get ship's manifests. And whatever's on the ship's manifest is just the names they get. So you've got a Greek ocean liner who's bringing Armenians and Assyrians on board. And the last name was Kavergus, right? But if you don't know the language, if I say Kavergus, do you hear a K or a G? Because on one form it's like Keorig, and you're like, what is that? And then another one's like Ges, and you're like, my head started exploding, right?
Yeah.
And on top of that, my grandfather's last name was Edgar, George Edgar. So, and nobody knew where Edgar came from. Almost 8 years to figure out where Edgar came from. Because, you get your father's first name becomes your last name. So his father's first name was George Sargus, right? So Sargus is George, but no one knew where Edgar came from. So when I was going to Ellis Island, I visited his nephew, Al, who had this big box of photographs. Now, my grandfather's father and the two older sisters came from Christiania, which is now Oslo, Norway, in 1916. They came to America, which I found out by chance by being at Ellis Island, looking up the names. And that was after I visited Al. He said, here's a box of photographs. And there was a picture of my grandfather's sister. And it says Nanajin, what's her first name? Nanajin Edgaroff on her wedding day in the Bronx. And I'm like, Edgaroff? Where the hell is Edgaroff? And I'm like, but that's the first clue I had to Edgar. So then I put in Edgaroff at Ellis Island, brought my great-grandfather up and his two daughters. And then I realized what they did when they came from which is now Oslo. They speak Armenian, you speak Assyrian, you speak Russian, you know, all those languages, because you're in that world. I realized that they pose as Orthodox Russians and crossed from, then Persia all the way across Russia, got to Oslo, and then came to America. So they hid under the name of Edgaroff. So then they got to America, dropped the off. All he got is Edgar, right? And then Sargus was obvious, being George, and so then that's how my grandfather became George Edgar. So well, that's it. I mean, that's not it, but that's sort of the scope of why I wanted to tell it. I mean, and honestly, and the biggest reason is I love my grandfather more than anything. My grandfather and I had just the world's best relationship, and we just loved each other dearly. I mean, it was a relationship of, he never withheld his love to me. He could be upset or mad, but it just, whatever it was, he just was the kindest man I ever knew. I only saw him once. In the 43 years I had him on this planet, I only saw him once. It was the most ferocious thing I'd ever seen in my life. But what he had to do to survive was unbelievable, in Constantinople, and catching a Russian dragoon raping his mother and taking his rifle and killing him. And I mean, and so many of these stories I got confirmed when I spoke to relatives, and it was just a huge story that just wanted to be told. But I mean, even though this is the Assyrian podcast, I wrote it because I loved my grandfather, who happened to be Assyrian.
Yeah.
Right. So if you read the book, I feel confident I never thrusted this is what happened to Assyrians, because I didn't want it to be that story. I wanted it to be his story. And in telling that, you get the backdrop of what Assyrians went through, and as a storyteller, I think it's the way you get people interested. It's the way you get people on board, because if you just say, oh, let me tell you about the genocide, this was this horrible event, other people go, okay, first you got to explain who Assyrians are, and you mean like the Jewish Holocaust? Well, no, but it's different. You mean like the Armenian? Everyone's got this tragedy story, and people within the culture, well, I know that story. And people outside the culture are like, well, I don't know if I particularly want to read about just that.
Yeah.
I always think of James Cameron's Titanic. He loved Titanic. And if he just made a movie about the ship, nobody would have cared. But what if you have a romance story on the ship that's, then and everyone knows about it. So I knew I was sort of killing two birds with one stone by making Assyrians known and their story and their history and their contributions and who they were. And I get to tell his story because I feel confident that the story was told. People who didn't know about Assyrians always say, "Oh my God, I had no idea about this culture, these people, and all that this happened." But they read through the whole book because they're following the character. Right?
Yeah, exactly. And that's what it's all about, that you're adding in that information about Assyrians in the background of the story. And people follow, the happiness, and they're not going to follow a story about genocide, like you said.
Yeah, you say the word, hey, would you like to read about a genocide? You're like, sure, just leave it on my desk. I'll get to it later. It's just, but how about a story and wrap it around? So, Ruth Kambar, who you mentioned earlier, has been a real champion of mine, and she's become a great friend. And Ruth is working very hard to get this. My vision originally was a movie, but I think, how am I going to tell these sweeping 3-4 decades in a movie? So then I thought, well, a 10-part limited series, sort of like Band of Brothers in 10-part series. So. And Ruth and I are talking about starting a GoFundMe to just raise enough money to have a pilot written and the subsequent episodes written out or outlined. So that's one phase to take it through. It's hard to get period pieces made. It's hard to get pieces made about that people don't know about. No, my grandfather is no one particular, just had this amazing journey. But you write the pilot and you hopefully take it out, and then and also and I'm very honored that Ruth is going to have a bit of my grandfather and a few things at the exhibit up at Cal State on June 30th. The Stanislaus Modesto Turlock exhibit, who was put on by Ruth Kambar, Hannibal Travis, Kathy Saeed Zatari, and Aaron Hughes. And it's from the grant from California Humanity at Cal State. And I'm sure you know about it coming up. Yeah. So she's working to have something of my book. If you go to my website, dragonsandviolins.com, I've, being a Hollywood guy, I put together a great trailer with images and music that sort of encompasses.
I saw that. Yeah.
Did you see it?
I did. It was like really cool. I mean, I read the book and then seeing the trailer, I was like, oh, I want to see this as a movie or a series. So.
Well, see, it's working. That's what you do. That's how you get projects sort of thrown out there. It's like, ooh, book, ooh, movie. So, if you go to the website, you could see the trailer. I mean, it's images from other movies with music, but it's combined. And my cousin Pierre, I showed it to him, and he's like, well, you need some Assyrian, and I'm like, well, it's kind of there. So it was his idea of in between when I bring up titles of the man, the husband, and war. There's Assyrian relief, stone relief. I put, but if you remember behind it, so that was Pierre's idea to just sort of add a little bit more, like, oh yeah, get a little bit more Assyrian in there.
Yeah.
And so that's what we're doing. I'm really honored she's going to have that something up there of me in the exhibit. I still have my grandfather's violin, and trying to see if I can work out something where it can be up there presented, or maybe a 3D holograph. We're working out those things right now, and I don't have a lot, but I have a few things to share. But the goal is, my dream is to have this made into a 10-part series, and where I tell his story, and then the world can learn who Assyrians are.
Yeah, through his story.
Engaged in the story. I mean, I think Dr. Zhivago is a great, thing. It's Dr. Zhivago and that story, and it's not about Russian and communism and the World War I and all, but you about that history because you follow the character. So. That's sort of this over here on one side. Well, I work on my career over here. This is over here. But Ruth has been a real champion of trying to get it out there and speaking to people on my behalf. And so I'm really thrilled that she's taking that on. It's a big journey, I mean, I honestly, it needs funding like anything, but maybe someday I can get a few Assyrians interested to back me.
Absolutely. So can you tell us some snippets of your grandfather's, life that really stood out to you, like events that you talk about in the book that are like, this is amazing. I mean, for me personally, reading through it, well, when he killed a man at a young age.
Yeah, well, yeah. So it was in the Caucasus where he killed the soldier, and then when it's funny in interviewing him, he wanted to go back as a boy. At about 10 or 11, he wanted to go back to Constantinople. He wanted to go back to Turkey. He really hated being in America because he was this poor immigrant kid. He says, I had one pairs of shoes. I didn't have clothes. He said, I had acne and people would make fun of me. And he says, when he got to Constantinople and Turkey in 1921, they were there for like 3 years. And he says, I had friends, I had a little job, I had pets. My mother was a cook at the American embassy. She got a job. And that was another thing, because I went to Turkey. I wanted to follow in his footsteps. And so he said, I remember the embassy as it had this huge eagle on the front steps of the building. And he described the building to me. And again, you're like, this is 70, 80 years later. So I went to Turkey. That embassy was closed, but it was still there. And it was boarded up. And someone who was a friend of mine there, I went to Turkey. She took me there, and there was that building, and there was that big eagle, and the side door. He described how we would go down to the side door, and he described it all to me. And I'm like, there's the building.
Yeah.
And he also, I remember him telling me that there was a man who was hoarding food and keeping it from the immigrants and whatnot that he got involved in. And because my grandfather had found out this man was trying to kill him. And he said that, his home was near these cliffs, and the cliffs were right on the river. And he said they were really tall, and I couldn't quite fathom what he was talking about, where the guy tried to kill him and he twisted it and got the guy fell over the cliff. And so I get to Istanbul, and I'm like, there's these massive cliffs. There's that embassy he was talking about. And, there are stories, of heroism of that is, he when they were fleeing in the Caucasus, there was a Russian dragoon who was raping his mother. He came down the stairs, and the guy had laid his rifle up, and my grandfather picked it up, and they shot the guy, and he said his mother, my great grandmother, was like, "What have you done? What have you done?" He's like, "Well," so they burned him in an incinerator at the local bakery, to hide the body. They were in terror, and in absolute fear about what was going on like that. I remember in World War II, he told me about this French Assyrian family he came across, and ironically, I found a picture of them because he just had all these documents, and there they are, this French Assyrian family, and you could see this little boys wearing this hat, my grandfather's little cap, right? And so he would all have these amazing moments in time that were, crazy. He was working for the gangster Dutch Schultz, running money and things like that. And the other thing is, when I was talking about this, my grandfather would tell me a story. As he moved into his teen years, he started telling me about his girlfriends, and I'm like thinking, and on his document it says 1915, so I'm thinking he's telling me these stories like he's 14, 15. I'm like, you seem awful mature to be having these relationships with girls at 14, 15. I just couldn't quite figure out, because I could follow the dates and timelines. Yeah. So one day I took the documents they had, and I don't remember why I thought this, but I took a little number 2 pencil with an eraser, and where it said 1915 on this large document, and I started to lightly rub on the 5, and the 5 disappeared, and it turned into a 2, and it was 1912. I'm thinking, when he's 15, or I thought he's 15, he's really 18. And so I realized what they did, because he's now in the American school system. he'd be too old for the classes. He would have no education in the classes. So they pulled him back 3 years so he could be at the proper education or right. So I'm like, so and he's got the body of an 18-year-old, and everyone thinks he's 15. He's this really well developed 15-year-old. So and if you see the book, he was an athlete too, around gymnastics. And there was a guy named Avery Brundage back then who said if you weren't born in America, you couldn't represent America. So he didn't get to participate. And that happened to other athletes. I think I remember that to a woman diver, and but there were other people that. So he didn't quite get his chance to go to the Olympics, even though he had qualified.
Yeah.
And, he just had these little moments in time. He went to a gym which was all Germans, right? And and he talk about in the book, they say, hey, you want to come to a Nazi rally? But Nazi rally in 1937 is just it's just a thing. It's they hadn't done their march into Europe yet. And he's like, no, I'm not into that. But he knew this one German gymnast who he ends up finding at the end of World War II. And I'm like, really? He says, yeah, we came into this town. These Germans surrendered. We took them to a POW camp. And I'm like, wow, I wish I could prove that. And in his files, there's this little piece of paper I found. It's a receipt for 157 German POWs he turned over, right? And that this guy was part of it. So it's just like every story he had, I was able to
verify.
And it was quite fascinating. The stories are just quite fascinating all the way through. He just sort of crossed paths of history, and then he was in D-Day plus 4 days after D-Day. He was from there till the end of World War II. And the things that they had to do it was quite amazing, because he was a bridge company, and they would just supply the bridge equipment and engineer build it. But every time they would get to a river, the engineers would go, like, we really don't know how to build this thing. You guys need to build it. So they'd end up building. And how World War II worked is every time the Allied forces advanced, every time they came to a river, he had to stop because there's a river there. And so he'd get to a river, and they literally would be this one river he got to. They said, you need to build a bridge and we'll cross it. And there's an artillery school that goes all the way back to the days of Napoleon. There's this German artillery school, and their thing is artillery, and they're just pounding the bridge. And they said, well, you got to go build the bridge while they're shooting at you. And then when you do, we'll cross and they'll stop. But there's no way we could stop them because we can't get there. You got to build a bridge. So that was, that was part of his heroism. But the through line all the way through was his violin. He was a violinist. So there was a guy named Russell Martin who was a book author, and Russell helped me edit the book over the years because I'd never written a novel before. So I hired Russell to be my editor as we went through, as he guided me to do it. Right, writing I know, but not in the book form. It's different than the screenplay. So Russell said to me, he says, we ought to write in there that he had a violin in World War II, and violin in combat, and a violin. And I said, Russell, it was the only time Russell and I argued over a 4-year period. I mean, we really got to argue. He goes, no, I'm not going to do it. I said, I never thought of asking my grandfather before he died, did you have a violin in combat? He goes, yeah, but it'll be you can embellish that. It'll be fine. And I'm like, oh, I don't know. I want to be real purist about this. I was really stickler about it. It was and I totally agreed with Russell. I just couldn't wrap my head around it. So one day on the internet, back in 2006, when documents were coming up, I found a fellow officer guy named Bill Baker. Who had all these documents in the National Archives. I'm like, oh my God, he has all these documents from his time. He wasn't an engineer, he was a replacement officer. So I called the National Archives. I said, hey, can I have these documents? He said, well, you got to get the permission of Bill Baker. I said, well, he's dead, He said, well, just write him a letter, certify it. When it comes back, show us. So I write Bill this letter that I'm not expecting anyone to read. So, dear Bill, I'm George Edgar's grandson. Could I XYZ this? And 2 weeks later, a letter comes back saying, oh, Dave, yeah, no problem. You could have whatever documents. And I'm like, holy God, this guy's alive.
Wow.
So I get on the phone, I call him, and I said, Bill, David Armstrong, George Edgar's grandson. He's like, oh my God, hi, how are you? And the first thing Bill says to me, he says, "Did you know your grandfather was a violinist?" I'm like, "Well, yeah, kind of did, you know." It's, yeah, he was in the, Santa Barbara Symphony Orchestra for 30 years. He's one of the founding members. Yes. He goes, "Do you know your grandfather had a violin all the way through combat?" And I'm like, holy my God. I'm like, really? He said, "Oh yeah. When we were on the front lines, he'd have a mute on it. He'd sit in his tent and play his violin in the tent while we're near the front lines, and we could hear this a mute like mutes it, right? But you could still hear the playing. But then when we were back off the lines, he'd play his violin." And I'm like, holy moly. So of course I've recorded the conversation and I have Bill on tape, but I didn't even ask him. I wasn't even going to ask him that. I was amazed that Bill was alive. So he was in Thomasville, Georgia. I flew to him from Georgia, interviewed him. I've interviewed men from his unit in like one of their last reunions, like 10 of them in Salina, Kansas. And, I ran around all around the world in America interviewing people. I just didn't want to make stories that were great stories, but I wanted them to be based in some truth. I always envisioned if I was ever up in front of an audience, and people questioned on me, I wanted to support it. And it just, that's why it took me 6 years of research. It was a lot of flying around, recordings, conversations, relatives, transcripts, and I had every recording of every conversation, and then you put it in transcripts and you have this mass thing, but that was it. And then I called up Russell Martin and I go, "It's in, the violin's in, he had one. Bill said it. I didn't even ask him." And it just changed everything. But it all revolves around that violin. And he had some PTSD after World War II that I didn't know about till after he passed. And I talked to relatives and said, "Yeah, your grandfather got to a point where he wouldn't even leave the house."
Wow.
He just wouldn't leave the house. He couldn't drive a car. And so the violin, a woman named Ann Tischer, who was a lifelong friend who moved to Santa Barbara, Ann Tischer said, "You got to get into this competition." And he won this competition to solo with the Chicago Symphony Orchestra in 1956. And I thought, wow, what a great way to end the movie. My idea of how the movie would start would be, you see this man in his white tuxedo with his bow tie, and he's backstage waiting to be called on stage, and he hears booming music, and the booming music will transition us back to a parapet in 1912 when Kurds were shooting and fighting with the Armenians and the Syrians, and his father was on the roof with a rifle on the parapet while his mother's giving birth in the barn. And that would be the opening, and the movie just, after 10 series, it comes back to the end. It comes to that moment in time where, the thing he was the most, he always said, "I never played as good as I did that night." In 1956, he said, "I never played as good," and it just has such a great book ending, and it's an Assyrian story, but it's an American story, hands down an American story, right? We're a country of immigrants.
Absolutely. Yeah.
This is an immigrant who was an engineer at Raytheon for 30 years. He had designed the first infrared scope, right, for rifles. He was in on the design of the first microwave, the Amana microwave, and I have a picture of him with it. The microwave is as big as if you took a van and tilted it up to down. Like, This is massive. It's like it took up an entire room, and it has this little tiny door for the microwave in this massive room. And so he was involved in being an engineer, liberating Europe. I mean, as a combat veteran, I mean, he was. He's flawed like all human beings, but as I idolized him as my grandfather. But even with all that idolization, I vetted all the stories, and it took me a long time. I mean, I had to go to Istanbul to check out the embassy. I had to go to Ellis Island to check out the records. I mean, it was a lot of research, but it's an American story, hands down, about an immigrant who just happened to be Assyrian.
Yeah.
And I think if I could ever get the movie made, that movies make such a difference in what we know in history. I'm like, you've heard of the Romans, right? But we know the Romans because there's Roman movies. When you see Gladiator, you get a sense of the Colosseum, and I think when a good story is told with, that story, people can learn who the Assyrians are. It's a great way to educate through story,
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, when I was reading it and I'm just going through after like every single thing in the book, and I'm like, there's no way that all of this happened to one person.
That's
Like,
what I said, and I wrote it. That's
I
why it
know.
took me 10 years. I mean, I really had to place him in the play. I knew he was in the Caucasus. I knew where they were. I have addresses to where they were.
Yeah.
I went and visited, his mother and father's tombstone in Connecticut. I wanted to see it and have it translated. It's in Assyrian and in English. I interviewed the relatives. I interviewed the combat soldiers. I mean, it's, there's also a website for his unit. It's called the 989th Engineer Treadway. .com or treadwaybridge.com, and but I think that's all listed on the website. And so I know it is, isn't it? It's hard to believe that happened, but then people will call me. I get calls. The most endearing thing about writing this book, which I didn't anticipate. I mean, I didn't think about, like, you think about how people are going to react, but the thing is, people call me and go, "Oh my God, this is my grandfather's story. This is my mother's story. This was, or Armenians, same thing, or Pontic Greeks. Like, oh, I'm Armenian, but this was the same journey." And it was so amazing to see it on paper and the stories. And then they start to tell me their stories, and they have the same, my father did this, these amazing events. Because here we are in safe America, it's safe here. And I have former students who are in the middle of Ukraine I have former film students who are, were literally making short films a month ago, and now they're manning machine guns at sandbags.
Wow.
And, that's so far from our thinking here in America. And, but not for Assyrians at that time. And his brother, Paul Edgar was head of the Dr. Edgar, who was head of the Assyrian Association in the Bronx in the 1930s, in 1933, and I have all those documents. And I still keep in touch with his daughter, Natalie, or born Natasha, and I have all these documents and papers and letters when he was head of the Assyrian Association in the Bronx in 33, and all the effort he was doing to try to make aware of what was happening in the genocide in Iraq, back then. And so they had quite a place, and my grandmother, you've seen the picture, my gorgeous grandmother, she was Miss Assyria of the 1933 Chicago World's Fair. And
I was going to ask you about that.
Yeah. And so, and that's Sarah Bennett's side of the family. Her name was Anne John, and she was born in Chicago. My grandfather proposed to her, I think, within 3-4 days after meeting, right? They waited a long time back then.
Yeah.
24 hours, give it 72 hours, I say. And so, she was, and I just recently found some footage that Ruth had showed me, some footage someone put up on YouTube, of Assyrian footage from people from Chicago and the Bronx back then. I found my grandmother in them.
Yeah, she showed me those.
Oh, did Ruth show you?
She showed me the videos. Yeah, it was really, really cool.
Beautiful grandmother in these videos. And I just reached out to Sarah's, I don't think, maybe a great uncle, Doug, who's got all this footage of the Assyrian families in Chicago, Super 8 16 millimeter. I'm organizing it to get it because I work in Hollywood. I can get stuff transferred and have it done correctly and, preserve the film. So I'm working on getting those transferred. Yeah, Miss Assyria, it's just, just two beautiful people.
I know.
They're great photographs. And it was interesting growing up. I grew up in Santa Barbara, right? So the Assyrian community was my grandmother and grandfather.
Yeah.
That was it. All I knew was my uncle, my mom, and that. There's no other Assyrians there. So growing up, I only knew these two Assyrians who I didn't speak Assyrian, but they come over for dinner, and they what sounded like yelling to me. They'd be yelling at each other, and I'm like, "What are you guys yelling about?" And they're like, "We're not yelling." But growing up, the first word I learned in Assyria was "chmada," right? Right? That was the first word I learned, because everything ended with yelling, and my grandmother going "chmada," and I'm like, so one day we're driving in the car as a little boy. My grandmother's in the passenger seat next to me, and my grandfather's driving, and they're having their discussion again,
Uh-huh.
which is not yelling, but it sure sounds like yelling to me,
Yeah.
right? And it ends with "Mother." And I go, Pop, what does that mean? And he very proudly said, it means genius. And I never saw my grandmother laugh harder. Never saw a woman laugh so hard as that moment. And then obviously I learned it meant, ass of a
Yeah.
donkey.
Yeah.
So, and my grandmother she was the sweetest, kindest, elegant woman. Oh, she made the best chip to soup in dolma. I'm like, I'd walk in the door and I could smell them. I just like, oh, my eyes would light up. So it just, I strangely, that was my Assyrian world,
Yeah.
growing up, and it expanded as I got to know my cousin Pierre and people through him and things like that, and the stories can go on forever, but yeah, it was great to have them as my grandparents, and his my grandfather was such an American. I mean, they loved their Assyrian. But my grandfather would say, "Look, we're Americans now." I'd say, "Can you teach me Assyrian?" And he'd be like, he says, "Look, you're an American now." And I've said that to people, and people go, "Oh, well, that's horrible." And I'm like, you got to take yourself back to 1921 and 1918, and you're leaving just death and war and all that all
Mhm.
that is, and you come to this country and you embrace it. It's different now with immigrants. Immigrants who come from Iran in the late 70s when the Shah was deposed. There's it wasn't he didn't want to keep the culture alive. It just I'm just an American now, and we're just this is our world, and but he always told me Assyrian stories. I mean, it was, and I get it back then. So I kept a little notebook and I would just ask him what things were called and write them
Mhm.
down. And I was trying to teach myself Assyrian. I think they didn't want me to know what they were supposedly talking about when
They were trying to keep their secret language
every
secret.
sentence ended with Khmada. It was like for years like, what does that mean? But and my uncle still lives there, and my mother lives in Asia. She lives in Bali, Indonesia. And, but I've had a rekindling with relatives. Sarah's been a great cousin. We've hit it off wonderfully. We talk, we text, and she's really into the history and genealogy, and
Mhm.
so keeping that alive, and you know that's 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 my story, and I'm sticking to it.
There you go. Why did you name the book Dragons and Violins?
It was the dragons of your life.
Mm,
Violins is obvious, I think,
yeah.
but the dragons of your life, the demons of your life. I remember, he had all these amazing stories, but they come with pain. And when I got to the part of World War II, and when I would come and I'd come and stay at his house for a week, and we would do the interviews. But I noticed when I started doing the World War II sections, he was starting to have nightmares again. I would wake up and I can hear him kind of calling out and screaming, and I've been sleeping in that house since I was
Mhm.
born. I mean, he is a little boy, like little baby, he'd give me baths and tell me stories. I mean, that was my safe world. I've never heard him have nightmares. And he told me, he says, "Yeah, I've just been starting to have nightmares, because the war and
Mhm.
conversations about that." And another fascinating thing is we were getting later in his life in those recordings, and he said, "Can we go back and talk about my father?" I said, "Sure." And he just looked at me one day and he said, "My father really hated me." And he says, "I don't know why. He just really had it out for me." And I've always guessed maybe why. I mean, because if you look, when my grandfather was born, his oldest brother was like 21, 22,
Mhm.
and then his sister was like 18 and 16, and Maria was like 14, and he's now, you know, and I've
The
always wondered,
youngest.
did he question, how did you get pregnant? I've been off in Russia doing my, wares and work, and he used to build instruments and whatnot, and I'm sure they're not familiar with how women get pregnant and are, oh, I'm ovulating, this is not, we can now have children. And,
Mhm.
I don't think sex ed was running around the parapet there back in old Urmia, right?
Yeah.
And so I've always questioned, he wonder how she got pregnant. Like he comes home and she's pregnant. And, is this mine? Is this, I've had to guess. But he started telling stories later in life. He's later in the interviews, he says, I don't know why he had such a hard, and I think that, I think I think that's why he was such a good grandfather to me. Maybe he was parenting me in the way he wanted to be parented. I think, and really giving and caring. One thing I learned about him and Assyrians is they're such givers of, like, oh my God, what a beautiful watch. Oh, please, please take the watch. Please have it. And so my whole life, my grandfather was always that way, like, oh, please, like, oh, this is wonderful. Oh, you must have it, right? This is such a thing. And so when he started telling me stories, he says, yeah, when I was a boy and he says his mother would say, we have guests coming over for dinner, hide all the good things. And I'm like, why? He says, oh, because if they liked it, you gave it to them. Take it. So the thing was, we have guests coming over, hide all the good things.
That's so funny.
So if they liked something, you didn't care. They gave it away. I'm like, oh, that's where that comes from. Like, why you're just so, oh, please take my watch. Here, please have this. So that cracked me up to learn it was hide the good thing. Guests are coming over. And it's not in the book. My mother would tell me images when she was a little girl, Nana Khatun, with my grandmother Catherine, right? He's just, what a combat-weary woman who had all these killed kids and went through that whole genocide in America. But she says, my images of my grandmother, she would sit there watching wrestling on television, smoking a hookah, and drinking a Schlitz malt liquor beer. That was her thing. Just old, tough. And if you see her later in life, you're just like, there's a woman I don't effing want to mess with. And she said, and I just have this vision of her just glued to the television, hookah, Schlitz beer, and wrestling.
Wow. And I love how you added in photos in the book because it really, really helped.
Oh, doesn't it? Yeah, I have hundreds of photos. I just was like, when I started going through his possessions, I'm like, oh my God, I have receipts for soldiers and POWs in World War II. I have the original photograph from the Caucasus that going through the American embassy. There's a receipt that when they were waiting for his father and two older sisters, after like 3 years, he earned $500 and he sent it. It was the Near East Relief Fund. And it said, this 500 is for my wife, Catherine George, to come to America with my children, George and Maria. Should she decide to stay, she can have $200 and $300 has to be sent back to me. I'm like, wow. You guys are hardcore back there. You're not coming? You only get 200.
200 only.
So, but they obviously came, and I have those and the photographs, and the photographs, it brings it to life. And I found all these pictures of my grandmother, the Chicago World's Fair, and they're dressed, their Assyrian traditional clothing, dress up, and I don't have it in the book, but there's a picture of her with her big banner sachet across her chest that says Miss Assyria 1933. I don't know, I was probably about 10. And she says, when I was a little girl during the Depression, we didn't have any toys, so we had to make our own toys. And she says, you want me to show you? I said, sure. So she takes out a cork from a wine bottle that had been pulled for my grandfather the night before, and she takes a little chunk of the cork out from the bottom of it, and she takes a little knife and she carves this little tiny ball that's maybe a half-inch in diameter. And I'm like watching, like, what are you doing? Right? And then she goes to the kitchen window where there was a fly buzzing around. She grabs the fly without killing it. She grabs the fly, she takes a sewing needle, and she sticks it in the back of the fly. And so now you have this needle sticking straight up. You have this fly who's alive like this, right? She then takes the other end of the needle and she takes the cork. She sets the cork on the table, and the end that wasn't carved is facing up, and she sticks the needle and the top of the cork. So you have a cork standing straight up. From there is a needle standing straight up, and a fly with its legs sticking up straight to the sky and going like this. Then she takes the little ball of cork and she puts it in the fly's hands, and the fly starts spinning the ball. It is the most ridiculous thing I've ever seen in my life. Like my grandmother, I'm just like jaw wide open, like, what the, right? And she says, yeah, we had to come up with things to do. We didn't have money.
That
Little
is interesting.
former out of this fly, and it's been because the fly's trying to grab onto something, so it spins the ball.
Oh my gosh.
I know. I'm like, oh my God. It's the most ridiculous thing I'd ever seen in my life. And the most amazing thing, right? I mean, like, imagine your grandmother sitting down.
Yeah. They had to use their imagination.
Yeah, well, yeah, I know. When you got a tin can and dirt is all you got to play with, because you come up with things.
You come up with things. So, what's one thing that people don't know about you? We talked about your career. We talked about the book and your grandfather and your family.
Wow. I don't know. I wish I could come up with something. I mean, I kind of just sort of put myself out on the table. I mean, my grandfather, my relationship, my story, my career. What, I don't want to throw it at you.
I don't know. Your childhood. You kind of touched on that in the book a little bit.
The book goes through, well, how that came to be?
Mm-hmm.
The things that you don't know about me are actually in the book. Okay, there we go. There are these, what I call the Dave chapters. They're like in between. So if you haven't read the book, there's chapters. They're about 34 pages long. And then in between them, I'm not telling you, obviously, the audience, that there's these, what I call the Dave chapters, like just 2 pages of me relating to my grandfather. So it talks about me being born in 1962, my childhood, which wasn't a great childhood. My mother's first husband was very abusive and alcoholic, and so I had there was a lot of abuse on that side in my mother's world growing up, not from her, but by my father and my sister's her second husband. So there's, that's why my grandfather's world was a place of retreat and get away from that tough childhood. But that tough childhood is also what informs me. Well, there's something maybe that childhood. I found an answer to your question. That childhood, it really informs me as a filmmaker, because if you want to be a director, when students say, well, what advice would you give me? I say, you need to have an extraordinary life and experiences. You have to bring experiences to the table when you're directing, because you can't, even though I've never been in war, I've been talked with enough people. I have some essence and feeling. But that childhood I had was a tough childhood, and my grandfather was my saving grace. I don't think I'd be the man who I am if it wasn't for my grandfather, who just had unconditional love for me, and a childhood that was really turbulent, that had abuse and alcohol in it. Not by me. I wasn't doing the drinking at 5. But that kindness my grandfather gave me saved my life. I don't, obviously I can't prove it, but I've often wondered why I didn't go the way of being an abusive man or an alcoholic. Because when you're a product of that, you can become that. You can become the environment you had growing up, and and I had to work through a lot to get over that abuse, and not deny it, and not blame anything. Not say, oh, I'm this way because that happened. It's my life. Shit happens to you, but I can't blame anyone. It's my life, and I have to straighten my own life out. But I think my grandfather's unconditional love for me, I think my grandfather's belief in me and whatever I was doing was great. It was, I didn't have a father growing up, right? So my mom divorced my father when he was like 3, and he was sent off to Vietnam, and he got horribly wounded and disabled. They gave him a Silver Star, but I met him once when I was 15. He was one screwed up guy from the Vietnam War. And so my grandfather was my father. He was my love. He's I think what kept me from, I don't know. Life could have been a lot different if it wasn't for him. It would have been a lot different had I not had that love. Plain and simple. I think, when you look at people who are tyrants in the world, people who seem to be insensitive to other people suffering. I think it's a product of their childhood. We're all childhood. You've heard of pit bulls, right?
Mm-hmm.
And pit bulls tend to have these horrible reputations. But did you know pit bulls were called nanny dogs? In England in the late 19th century, in the 1800s, pit bulls were nanny dogs because they were the one dog you could leave your children with, and the dog would watch after them. He would take care of them. They were the dog you could trust more than any other animal to watch after your dog. Now, pit bulls get a bad reputation because they're abused to be mean, right? And so then they get this reputation, and you find out they're called nanny dogs.
Yeah.
And you have great 18th century dogs. So I mean, we are a product of our upbringing. And I think maybe something, what do people know about me that don't know about me? Is that I think life obviously would have been something else. I can't say what it was, but I'm pretty confident had he not been there and just loved me unconditionally, that unconditional love set me on a path to, my life, and he saved me.
Mm-hmm.
I think that, and the book comes out of just absolute love for him, and that payback, and because of that, I mean, I was with him to the day he died. I held him in my arms as he let his last breath out. And I talk about that in the book.
Mm-hmm.
And he was at this hospital in Ojai. And I would go in his last 3-4 weeks of his life, I would go every day and I'd sit with him for like 10 hours. And I did not want him to leave this earth alone. And he was in one of those hospitals where they morph out old people and nobody visits. And, it's sort of a train station, train way. It's to death.
Mm-hmm.
And I just couldn't stand for him to do that. And he had created such a great relationship with me. It was hard, but it was easy. It was like, and I remember leaving there one day, and a nurse at like 10 o'clock at night, she said, "Why do you come every day?" And I said, "Well, because I love him and I don't want him to leave alone." And I said, "Why do you ask?" She goes, "Because no one comes to visit these people. You're the only one." I said, "Well, it was easy to do because he created that relationship. He made the bed, right? He made his bed, and that bed was that relationship with me. Not to speak of anyone else's relationship, but it was, there's something nobody really knows about me, because that's what's behind the book."
Mm-hmm.
It was just pure love, and I wanted to tell his story. And that's, it was, if I leave this earth, writing that book will be my greatest accomplishment. That is like it.
Mm-hmm.
I have other goals in the film industry and screenplays and this book into a movie, but writing that. And one last thing, I guess, when you think about what are some things that people don't know about you, you don't think about them because nobody knows, because they're buried so deep. But I remember the night I was done with the book, like I was going to hit the send button to the publisher. Once I hit the send button to the publisher, it was done. It was done. And I remembered suddenly getting ready to hit that send button, and I remembered thinking, I had a moment. It took me about 10 minutes to hit the send button. I said, this relationship in this moment is about to end. Because he'd been dead, but because relationships are in thought. They don't exist in physical form. Like the minute your mom leaves, your dad leaves, the relationship doesn't end because they're not there. And when people die, the relationships actually become stronger. You think about them more. You have conversations with them. You speak to you. What would they say? What would they do? And I had been writing about him for almost, 7 years, 8 years at that point, 7 years at that point after he left. And I realized that I wasn't going to be thinking about him on a daily basis. And once I hit the send button, it was sort of losing him all over again in a way, because now this is going to come to an end. And because every day I'm thinking about him, right? Writing, thinking, researching, talking to Russell. And so there was a second letting go. The send button, because and I haven't read the book since I published it in, November 2010, I think. I've been thinking about rereading it again. And you forget a few things that are in there. this part that you wrote about this, and you're like, oh, is that in the book? Oh, yeah, that's right. Because it's now going on 11 years or 10 and a half
Yeah.
years I've written it, so I haven't revisited it yet, and I think maybe I've just recently been thinking, I think I'm going to reread it again.
Yeah. Well, you'll go through that journey again with the movie, hopefully.
Oh yeah, and then you got to refine it into its purest form, because you got to just find those beats, and so with Ruth's help, I'm hoping that we can get enough, maybe crowdfund and raise the money to write at least the pilot and the episodes, and I think it would be an amazing story.
Absolutely, I agree.
So how the Dave chapters came about was I had finished the manuscript and I thought I was done. And a very close friend of mine, she's a director from Canada. Her uncle was the head of Penguin Books, I think, Canada and USA. And he was so kind to take the manuscript and give it to his main reader. And they read it. And they came back and they said, well, this is really well done, but they were very honest, which I guess in book industry you got to be. They said, so what? So he was this guy that did all these things. What was your relationship to him? What was your connection to him? What was the human connection of all that? And I came back. I was like, well, geez, I hadn't thought about that. And also the book ends, as you've read, it ends in 1956 when he solo with Chicago Symphony Orchestra. So they gave me a sort of an odd compliment, was like, well, what happened to his sisters and his mother and his wife Anne, and what happened to everyone? Because it just stopped in 1956. He says, you just leave us hanging with this great story, and we don't know where they went. So Russell said, why don't I do this? David Russell Martin, the editor, he said, why don't I interview you and I'll write the Dave chapters, and we'll just do like 2 pages between each chapter. That way you get my relationship to my grandfather and what happens to everyone as time goes on, and then we go back. Kind of like when you saw the Titanic, we were present day when she's an old woman, and and then she starts talking, we go back to the Titanic. It was kind of that in storytelling. So Russell wrote those chapters, and I didn't have anything to do with them. I mean, I could have said no, but he asked me about my life, and he interviewed me, and then wrote those, and we put them between each chapter, so you got my relationship to him, maybe some parallels, right? Like when my grandmother, his wife Anne, and she died, that's in there, and so you got a sense how the story ended. Because I just was ending it in 1956. Because then he comes to America, and he starts the Santa Barbara Symphony Orchestra with other members, and it's not as it's not as tumultuous. It's not he lived in Santa Barbara. Oh my God, the chaos of Santa Barbara, right? So that was that's how those chapters. So then I went back in, put those chapters in, and as I call them, the Dave chapters. Those are how people got to get something personal from me and my connection to my grandfather, and you got to find out how it all ended for everyone. So that's how it came about.
Are you directing anything right now in Hollywood?
Not directing anything at the moment. I mean, I have a screenplay that's being read, well, actually today by one. I have another screenplay being read by a famous Hollywood couple who are both actors. And I have to leave it at that. Just
Okay.
that they're reading. It's a horror. It's a really, really cool horror story that I didn't write, called Mine, Mine, and I'm hoping they like that. So, and it's the Hollywood game is you sit around a fire with a bunch of pokers in the fire, and you're waiting for one to get red hot. And you walk by, and you're like, "How's it going, Dave?" Well, just sit by the fire waiting for one of these to get hot. But Ruth has recently said, let's start a GoFundMe. Let's raise the money so we can take the time, because Valerie has her job and a screenplay she's working on. So we need to raise the money. If we're going to stop and write the pilot, we have to stop doing things that make money for us right now. So we can concentrate on that. And we're I mean, it's go for maybe like $40,000 or $50,000 to raise it, because it's a lot of work.
Mhm.
Just, writing a pilot, especially when I got to synthesize it down from a book. Right.
Yeah.
So you really have to figure out what are the 10 episodes and what do they encompass. And, we'll, stay tuned. We'll hopefully,
Yeah.
if we could raise the money to get it going, it'd be the love of my grandfather and a huge contribution. I believe it'd be my contribution to my Syrian legacy, my Syrian family
Mhm.
heritage. I would love to really branch out more and sort of, when you mention Assyrian, I'm like, oh, what's that? You've had it, sure.
Yeah.
What's that?
Numerous
Right, the
times.
super mega Assyrian, what's that? I'd like to put us on the map a little bit more.
Mhm. So we have listeners all around the world listening to the Assyrian podcast. To end off the episode, what is one final thing that you would like to say to our listeners?
Oh my goodness, that's a big audience, all the way down to Australia and
Everywhere, you name it.
Sherlock and Chicago and
Mhm.
Iran, Iraq. I have Assyrian cousins in Lebanon. Well, I'm very proud to be an Assyrian. I mean, it's the one half of me. I think I saw it in an Assyrian convention. They even had a shirt that said, "I'm half Assyrian." Like, I don't know if I want to wear that, but but yeah, I love my culture. I love my heritage. I think it's an amazing, I mean, we're credited as ruling the only nation to have ruled the known world, far and above Rome, which I think is amazing.
Mhm.
Um, my goal is to hopefully have the support of the Syrian community to help me tell a story that will engage non-Assyrians and as engage people who've never heard of Assyria or Assyrians, and let them know of who we are, our culture, our base, our history, our place in the world, and all that we have to contribute. So I'd be honored if they read my book. That would certainly be nice. I think they would like it. You know, you like it, so there's one person I know for sure likes
There
it.
you go.
Yeah, so I'm doing good. But yeah, I hope to have that support someday. To try to get it. I mean, I don't think it's a long shot. I mean, every time I meet someone who's read my book or knows, they're like, "Oh my God, you got to make that into a movie! Like now, you got to do it now." I'm like, "Well, it's a long process here in Hollywood, but
Yeah.
I started with the book, and now we're going to try to do a pilot
Yeah.
and see if I can't shop it around town or get, or find Assyrians out there who would love to support and back us. I mean, Ruth is working that part of the world, and we certainly could bring someone on who could be a producer, an executive producer for this production.
Yeah.
But that's what I would say to everyone.
Very good. David, thank you so much for being on the Assyrian podcast.
No, my pleasure. It's very kind of you. Thank you.
Thank you so much for listening to the Assyrian podcast and your continued support. Please be sure to subscribe wherever you're listening and share this episode with your family and friends. Thank you and see you all next week.